I did those for Jeff.
I just gave you 100 for both.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, let's rock and roll. Evolution and biodiversity. Yeah, so this is from the old book. Don't worry about it, what you do. All right, so things we're going to talk about today: origins of life, evolution, evolutionary processes, niches, species formation, and extinction. All right. Start off with what is evolution? Evolution is change over time, change over long periods of time. So you start off with chemical evolution, how Earth went from a place with no life to the first beginnings of life on Earth. The classic experiment is the Miller and Urey experiment, where they set up but they set up a chemical situation that mimicked early Earth by looking at what's in rocks and what's in ice cores, and then struck it with lightning and saw if over time they could get organic molecules to appear, and they did. And so you get those first organic molecules, biopolymers, chemical reactions. You get that chemical evolution for the first billion years of Earth. So from the time you had the Earth form as a rock to your first protocells in the seas, you have a billion years. And that's something that really we have to wrap our minds around. It took a long time to even get to anything coming from living things. And in the past 3.7 billion years, we've gone through biological evolution. Those first simple cells to our multicellular organisms like us and other things. So how does this happen? Microevolution, and then you have on a large scale macroevolution. Microevolution is evolution within a species where you have change in a genetic material through natural selection and other things. The driving force for microevolution is mutation. Mutation is how you get a difference in your genes. Now, some mutations do nothing. Some mutations cause a malformation or some pathologies, and some mutations actually give an advantage. It's those mutations that give an advantage for survival that then get magnified and what drives species to change over time. Migration is also a big other thing about it. Species moving from one area to another. If two groups of the same species move to different ecosystems, then over time they're going to change because the adaptations to fit the different ecosystems are going to change. Genetic drift is what happens when you have a random change in your gene pool that just kind of takes off by chance. Example of genetic drift would be there are more redheads in Ireland because you have a smaller population, and just by chance over time they're ended up with that gene specifically over other genes. There's no specific adaptation for it, but that's where you get the genetic drift, that random change. And then you have natural selection. Natural selection is pretty straightforward. If you have an adaptation that allows you to be able to be more successful at reproduction, then that gene is more likely to go on to the next generation. Yeah. All right, computer. There we go. Went too fast. All right. So this is just an example here looking at some bugs. Imagine that you observe an increasing frequency of brown coloration genes and a decrease in the frequency of green coloration in a beetle population. Why might that have happened? And so this is just looking at the different mechanisms. The first way is just a mutation. You have two green bugs get together, a mutated gene results in a brown bug, excuse me. It's just mutation. Different gene, get a different color. Then you look at gene flow or migrations. Okay, so maybe some bugs with brown genes migrated into a group with green genes and mixed up together. Then you have genetic drift. Genetic drift, as I said, is that random chance. Sometimes you just get something that there's more of just through, strange percentages. And then natural selection. If the green bugs got eaten more because the birds can see them, they're not going to be able to make as many babies. You're going to have more brown genes in the next generation. Pretty straightforward deal, and a lot of it, you know, straight out of your biology textbook, hopefully. Other things about natural selection, for it to occur, you have to have differential reproduction. You have to have a system set up so that this trait allows one organism to be able to reproduce more often than another organism. Anything that is a trait that allows you to do that is an adaptive trait or an adaptation. And then sometimes you actually have two species that evolve side by side with one another. That's coevolution. Populations of two different species interact over a long period of time and kind of evolve together. Sometimes that can be a good thing where you have, for example, bees and flowers. The flowers evolve to look pretty so that they attract the bees, and the bees come and pollinate them. And the bees evolve to prefer pretty looking flowers because that's where their food source is. Then you have the flip side of that. The rabbits evolved to be able to run really, really fast to be able to outrun the foxes, but then the foxes evolved to run faster to catch the rabbits. And so you have two different kind of ways to look at coevolution. Here's another example of coevolution. You have certain forms of ants that like eating fungus. Well, the fungus that they like to eat can be taken over by a microfungus, a pest that eats their fungus before they can get to it. And the ants evolved this bacteria that they carry that have a toxin to kill the microfungus that protects the fungus that they want to eat. Kind of like the anemone and Nemo. You know, Nemo lives there, protects the anemone from predators, and the anemone also, you know, has a little house for Nemo, if you would. Macroevolution is over long periods of time if you're talking about macroorganisms, but if you're talking about bacteria, macroevolution can actually happen over a very short period of time. Macroevolution is enough change where you have an entirely new species. So large scale change where you have an entirely new species, where the species that you have after the macroevolution, if you went back in time, would not be able to reproduce and produce offspring with the original species. You're changing the gene enough to be an entirely new species. All right, look at that, niches. Niches is just an organism's way of life. Some people say niche. I like niches, whatever. So niche is just a way of life. It's everything an organism is doing. It's where an organism lives, how it eats, what it eats, how it mates, when it mates. An organism's complete way of life, how it lives, is its niche. Like I said, it's multidimensional. There's lots of different things that have to do with an organism's niche. Pretty straightforward deal. We talked about this in kind of in passing the other day. If you have two organisms that live close to one another, you actually can have what's called competitive exclusion, where no two organisms can live in the same niche at the same time. If two organisms are living, or two species are living and trying to do the same niche, one of them is going to either have to migrate away, die, or change what they do. If you're trying to eat the same thing, live in the same place, and live the same lifestyle as another species, it just isn't going to work. That's the competitive exclusion principle. Now, you can maybe eat the same thing and you eat it in the daytime and I eat it at nighttime. One species eats it at day, one species eats it at night. Or maybe you can have different migration patterns, or live in the same place and eat off slightly different things. So you can change the niche a little bit. And then you have two different ways to look at that: the general species and specialist species. We'll talk about that as well. General species have very broad niche, can eat lots of different things, live lots of different places, and have very, very broad lifestyles, where specialist species have a very narrow niche. They can only eat in certain ways. There's certain species of crabs that only survive in the waterfalls of mountain streams. And so that would be a specialist niche. Whereas humans and a lot of mammals are generalist niches. They can, general species, they can live in lots of different places and survive in lots of different things and eat a lot of different things. So it's kind of what we were just saying, have a wide range of tolerance, eat a lot of different things, live in a variety of places, generalist species. Then you have specialist species, have a narrow niche, they live in only a specific habitat, only a few different types of food, things like that. So this is an example of competitive exclusion here with two different species of barnacles. Fundamental niche is anything it could eat, any place it could live. If everything was perfect for a species, this would be its niche. The realized niche is what actually happens because of competition. So if you look at these two organisms here, you have the balanus species of barnacle down here at the bottom, and the thalamus species of barnacle up there at the top. So it says, what's the realized niche of each barnacle? What is the fundamental niche of each barnacle? What we're seeing is which one? Realized or fundamental? Realized. Yeah, we're seeing the realized niche. So the fundamental niche, I think maybe you could guess, will be a little bit broader. Balanus is where it is, hypothalamus is where it is, and you can look at the next slide. It's showing you the realized niches of where they are allowed to live. Now, if you look at this slide, who's winning the competition? Yeah, the balanus is winning the competition because if you look, the fundamental niche, if you took balanus away, if a bacteria came along and destroyed the balanus barnacle, thalamus would be able to, pretty much cover that whole area. But since it is more generalized, it is not as competitive in that area, and it actually slides out of the way to make room for the other one. So it's fundamental niche versus realized niche. Pretty straightforward deal. Phenomenon leading to do that is resource partitioning. This is where you might not be able to get all of the food that you would like to eat, but you can eat a certain amount because you realize that's what you can do to survive in that ecosystem. If competitors are removed, pretty straightforward, what happens? If I removed the balanus, the other one would expand, absolutely. All right, some miscommunications about evolution. The biggest one, and this is something I hear all the time, there's a couple big ones. One is not on the slide, and that is that evolution means we came from monkeys. All right? The problem with that statement is that it's missing a couple different things, and because it's meant to rile people up, and it's meant to get people to not listen to their science teacher. First problem with that statement is it's not evolution. If you're talking about human evolution, it's not necessarily that we came from monkeys, it's that present day monkeys and us descended from the same ancestor. So it's a kind of a different way to look at it, and it's a way that maybe isn't so emotional when people think about it. Another thing is this word right here, survival of the fittest. And it has to do with both of these words being misunderstood. What do we think about when we see the word survival? When you hear the word survival, what does it mean? Fighting to survive, but just the word survival. If you survive, what have you done? You've gotten by, you have lived. You have not died, right? Make sense? That's not what the word survival means in this, and we'll talk about what it means in just a second. Same thing with fittest. We get very confused because in middle school and elementary school, we take physical education, PE class, sometimes called physical fitness. And so when we think of that word fittest, what do we think of? Strongest, most physically fit, most physically well, being able to run a race, being able to win a sports contest, being able to lift something heavy. That's what we think about with fittest. Not being overweight, having lots of muscles. All of these things spring to mind when you say the word fittest. But both of those words are misrepresented in this original phrase. First off, we weren't talking about, when Darwin was talking about survival of the fittest, he wasn't talking about survival as in you got to live. He was talking about survival of your genes. How do your genes survive? How do you pass on your genes? You make babies. So survival here isn't talking about survival of you or me. It's talking about survival of our genes. Our genetic code lives on. Same thing with fitness. If you look up fitness in a health book, you'll get that definition we just learned. We all know it is in our head. But if you look up fitness in a good biology book, it's going to say the ability to reproduce, period. Fitness in biology class, in environmental science class, does not mean fitness. It means how many babies have you made. Fitness is how much you reproduce. So survival of the fittest does not mean you get to, that only the strong survive. Only the strong get to live. What it means is, if you can make a lot of babies, if you can make a lot of babies, then your genes survive. So survival of the fittest, that we got to make sure we understand. It's not survival of the strongest. It is a measure of reproductive success. It's a measure of how well you're able to reproduce. Evolution, and another misconception. We like to think of ourselves at the apex of evolution. Look, we are the shining examples on Earth of 4.7 billion years of evolution. The idea, the problem with that is, number one, evolution isn't over. It's still happening all the time, every day. And number two, there's no end point. There's no grand plan. There isn't a, start at simple cells and finish at the glory of a human. Evolution, it happens. It's just the way it is. There isn't this goal. There isn't this plan. There isn't a top point in evolution. It just keeps happening. So next thing is speciation. How you get new species. How you go from one species to more than one species. Some members of the population can no longer breed with other members of the population. That's the simple definition. Where you end up with a new species if you have members of your population that can no longer make babies with other members of the population. Has there ever been a human speciation? Let me rephrase. Has there ever been a hominid speciation? We are hominids, that's our family. How many species of hominids are there on Earth right now? It's a pretty simple question. One. Homo sapien. Now, there are species in the same lineage. You have things like Homo erectus, Australopithecus, and the hominid history of how we got to Homo sapien. And most scientists in their study have come to the conclusion that at certain points in hominid evolution, there were as many as 3 or 4 different species on Earth at the same time. Now, in modern times, we only have one, but if you only go back, 50, 60,000 years, you can go back to a time where you had 3 different distinct species of hominids on Earth. Homo neanderthalis in Europe and Homo floresiensis in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. Now, without finding a living example of those, it's hard to really study the genetic material, but paleontologists are way smarter than me, have figured out a way to really look at the genes and the difference in the genes, looking at bones, and found human speciation, hominid speciation occurring in the past 1 million years. Pretty wild little deal. So there's an example here. You have different groups of the same species, same population, become physically isolated from one another for long periods of time. This is geographic isolation. The Arctic fox moves north, the gray fox moves south. They look very, very similar, but they have very specific adaptations to their ecosystem. They very rarely see each other, so they rarely interbreed. And so as long as this happens for a few thousand years, you get different species. If you tried to mate an Arctic fox and a gray fox, the odds of you making viable offspring are pretty low because they don't see each other. So you have geographic isolation for a long period of time. Here's another example of this. Reproductive isolation with or without geographic isolation. Allopatric speciation is where you have a physical barrier between two spots. Then you have sympatric speciation where there's no physical barrier, but you just have two different ecosystems living in the same way. So allopatric speciation, there's a physical reproductive barrier. There's a canyon between the two different species and they can't reproduce. Then you have sympatric speciation, where reproductive barrier is created by something other than geographic isolation. Maybe it's time of day that they reproduce, the organisms that are eating them, all kinds of other things, and there's examples up here. Here's another example of the allopatric speciation, that geographic isolation. Those two guys look exactly the same. If you went to the Grand Canyon and found the antelope squirrel, Harris's antelope squirrel on one side of the Grand Canyon, the white-tailed antelope squirrel on the other side of the Grand Canyon, they look almost identical. You know, if you weren't someone who was spending their life studying these squirrels and I put two in front of you, you'd be like, hey, that's the same species. But if they tried to mate, it wouldn't work because they've been isolated for their entire species history. Now, why do you have two species that look the same? You have a common ancestor, but you also, you live, the ecosystems are almost identical. But how they got to their final form was probably a different genetic path. So you end up with different genes on either side of the Grand Canyon, so different that it's a different species. So it prevents interbreeding, pretty straightforward. The genes become so different that you end up with two different organisms. Some other examples. You can have ecological isolation. They live in the same place, but they don't mate because they just don't see each other. One's living in a tree and one's living on the rock. You can have temporal isolation. Maybe one group is mating at night and one group is mating during the day. And so you have a time difference, temporal isolation. You have behavioral isolation. You see this with birds, especially in areas where there is plenty of food. If you're living in areas like the certain jungles or certain forests where you got plenty of food, competition over food is not a problem. You're going to end up with this behavioral isolation where they got to find their own way to find the best mates. And so they start these songs, they start these dances, they start these different colorations that separates them out. And eventually, you're only going to hear that song to mate with that thing. And over time, you deal with a completely different species. The classic example of this is the birds of paradise on the island of Borneo. It's an island, so you would think that the ecosystem is pretty much the same for everybody, but you end up with these 20 or 30 species of birds of paradise because they all have different colors and different dances and different songs. And I got some video of that if you want to see it. It's fun stuff. Other thing, like I said with birds, these courtship rituals, having these specific dances that show I'm your species. If you mate with me, you will be successful. Not only that, it's a way to peek at something's genes. Now, if you live in an area where there's not as much food, it's a whole lot easier to tell. If you live in the desert, there's not as much food, you look at another organism, it's like, hey, you're up and healthy. Your genes are good because you're surviving. Literally, not evolutionarily. In areas where there's plenty of food, you got to be able to peek at something's genes. And so you have these awkward, these crazy looking dances where, oh wait, your neck was a little bit to the left there. Something's not quite right with your genes. I'm not going to mate with you. That dance over there, though, that dance is perfect. I need to make babies with that one because that one's genes are perfect. Now, this is just animals and not humans, right? Go ahead. What do you mean?
I don't know. Just saw you were looking. I was like, no.
We do this. This is why that boy's good looking to you, or that girl's good looking to you. Because what you're doing is you're taking a peek at their genes. You're taking a peek at their genes, and you're saying, when you say, man, that boy is hot, what you're really saying from an evolutionary standpoint is, I want my baby to look like him. You think about what makes someone pretty. Symmetry. You know, if somebody has one eyeball that's over here, it's all looking off to the side, you say, ew, I don't want to talk to that person. I don't want to hook up with that person because I don't want my baby to look like that. There's something wrong with that person's genes. I don't want my baby to look like that. So it's this, we do this just as much as birds do this. You know, we have these reasons, you know, pretty much everything that you can list of a way that you will say someone's hot or attractive or good looking. There's an evolutionary reason for it. I want somebody with shiny hair, good genes. I want somebody with clear skin. They're dodging the bacteria and the fungus. Good genes. So, something to think about there. Another thing we talk about when we talk about things like ligers is sometimes you are able to make hybrids. You are able to take two different species and make a baby, but then you end up with infertility. This is the deal with the donkey and the horse. Donkey and the horse make a mule. Mule's a good animal. It works, but mules are most of the time going to be infertile. Cannot make babies themselves. I think that might be a good stopping point. Yeah. So that's evolution. Any questions on evolution? All right, so we got about 30 minutes or so. If you want to at home, check it out here in the class as well. Invasive species assignment is up on the modules. Pick your species before somebody else does, and you can go ahead and start working on one poster if you want to, or you can find something else quiet to do. If there's no questions about evolution, we are going to roll on and have a great day, guys.